Hello and welcome to Roundtable. How green, how clean can nuclear power be? Should it be on the European Union's list of sustainable fuel sources? It is a question that's dividing Europe. France leading pro-nuclear countries, Germany lobbying hard to keep it off the EU's sustainable list. A decision expected soon on an extremely controversial subject. Well, France gets most of its power from nuclear fuel, while Germany plans to shut down its last reactors next year. How can nuclear fuel help towards net zero? How safe is it? And what will a decision either way mean for the European Union? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. So let's take a look at the two opposing sides in this debate with France on this. Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic and Romania. There are others too, but I mentioned just one or two. Germany now has the backing of Austria, Denmark, Luxembourg, Portugal and Spain. And we have this from Leonora Gewessler, the Austrian Minister for Energy. We have plenty of evidence of how dangerous nuclear power can be. Well, we're going to hear from France's president in just a moment, but let me introduce our guest first of all. Joining us from Paris, Paul Dorfman, chair of the Nuclear Consulting Group. In the Netherlands, Jan Haverkamp, senior expert in nuclear energy and energy policy for Greenpeace. We go to Germany, Dortmund, where we see Rainer Klute, chairman of Nuclearia, and in Chicago, Mark Nelson, managing director of the Radiant Energy Group. Now, Paul and Jan, you're opposed. Then we have you two, Mark and Rainer, who are in favour of nuclear energy. Let's hear what Emmanuel Macron has to say.
Mais si nous voulons payer notre énergie,
if we want to pay for our energy at reasonable rates and not depend on foreign countries, we must continue to save energy and invest in production of low-carbon energy on our soil. This is why, in order to guarantee France's energy independence, to ensure our country's electricity supply, and to achieve our objectives, in particular carbon neutrality in 2050, we will, for the first time in decades, relaunch the construction of nuclear reactors in our country and continue to develop renewable energies.
Let me ask you this. Can nuclear energy ever be totally safe?
Well, there is no such thing than total safety in no kind of electricity production. But nuclear has a track record of being a very, very safe form of electricity production. I think no other means can have this track record. So from a practical point of view, nuclear energy is safe indeed.
So the industry's come a long way, you would say, since 3 Mile Island in the 1970s, since Fukushima this century. We'll leave Chernobyl out of that because that was an entirely different story. But do you think the industry's come a reasonable distance in improving its track record?
Absolutely. I mean, look at the numbers. No other electricity production has such a low number of victims per produced energy unit.
Okay, Jan, well, let me put that one to you. It is pretty safe. It's not foolproof, but it's pretty safe, he says.
Well, I think people will remember Fukushima still very well. And I think if you have a technology where if it goes wrong, you have to evacuate 160,000 people, then I do think it's quite clear that there are risks there that we as society have problems with dealing with. And that is also for the current generations nuclear power stations. It can go wrong. If it goes wrong, it goes very wrong. And those are the kinds of shocks that we can't afford. We need to tackle.
But if you leave renewables out of this, and they are there, but they're not the main source of energy at the moment, and you look at coal-powered stations, energy stations, coal-powered reactors, the number of deaths that are caused by pollution far outweighs those number of deaths that have been caused by nuclear radiation, surely.
Well, nuclear power is also not a very large energy source. To be very honest, we're talking about less than 10% of the global electricity production, and less than 8% of energy production. Comparing that with coal is the wrong comparison. We have to replace coal.
But coal is what we have at the moment, and Germany's phasing out nuclear, and it's still using coal.
And then you don't. No, but then you don't replace that with another power source that also has very large-scale risks attached to it. That's just a no-go.
Okay, let me go through some of the figures. You talk about the number of nuclear reactors there have been. Here's a bit of history. The world's first full-scale power station, nuclear power station, that was in the United Kingdom, called a Hall, 1956. There are currently 443 nuclear reactors in some 30 countries. Let's pick a few countries. The US got 93, France 56, very keen on nuclear energy, China 50, Russia 38. The number is going down. And Mark, I'll be coming to you on this. In the United States, 39 have been closed. In the UK, 30 have been closed. In Germany, 30 have been closed. Japan, 27 closed. Isn't France bucking the trend here?
First of all, I'm very glad to say that the number you cited for the United States is no longer correct. We have, at the moment, just 3 nuclear plants in danger of closing, and we're fighting very hard to stop that closure. It's mostly young people fighting against folks like Jan and Paul to defend our energy sources and our clean energy. So we're being successful. Fortunately, their generation is fading in importance and influence, and we're saving those nuclear plants. I will say that France is not at the moment the leader in building nuclear. A lot of countries around the world are adding nuclear, and the number is expected to go up in the next years, not down.
Okay, give us some examples of where it's actually increasing other than France.
Oh, sure. So Turkey, Bangladesh, Egypt are 3 very high population developing countries getting their first large new nuclear plants. The UAE in the Middle East is a great example of a large fossil fuel producer that has staked its future on nuclear energy. And there are many other countries like the UAE that are rich on fossil fuels that are about to start their nuclear energy programs. In Europe, there are several countries launching nuclear energy programs as we speak.
Mark, you say the number 3 in the United States. I was simply referring to 39 that have closed. We will beg to differ on that. I know you say they're still producing the same amount of energy, even if all those have gone. But let's go to you, Paul. Mark's making the point that more and more countries are going nuclear, and particularly some that you might not expect, those that have been heavily dependent on making money out of fossil fuels.
Let's look at the figures worldwide. Last year, 256 gigawatt of non-hydro renewables was added to the global electricity market. Nuclear added 0.4 gigawatts. So one needs to keep this in proportion, this idea that nuclear is the new kid on the block. In terms of the International Energy Agency, they say that this year 290 gigawatts record will be added, and we're expecting by 2026, 4,800 gigawatts of renewables will be added. That's equivalent to current total fossil fuel and nuclear combined.
I was looking at your website, and there's an awful lot of experts on there, and I was drawn by something that Jonathan Porritt, the environmentalist, put up, which said that this was a COP26. Less attention was paid to the large number of pro-nuclear delegates parasitically inserting themselves into as many events as they could engineer access to. That doesn't sound much like an intellectual debate.
It's a problem. The nuclear lobby is hugely powerful, and it's well resourced. And there do seem to be problems with it. I mean, there do seem to be problems in terms of the links between the nuclear industry and excessive lobbying in terms of government. That's especially problematic when the International Energy Agency says that there will be a 95% increase in global renewable power in 2026. So despite all of the recent, and there's been a huge push, huge PR push for nuclear, despite all of that, the reality is there's really quite a small player in all of this, and will be.
But would you not expect renewable companies, fossil fuel companies, all to be doing the same amount of lobbying, and yet you seem to regard what the nuclear industry does with particular distaste?
Well, I mean, I think everyone tries their best, but if one looks at the recent PR, if one looks at what's happened over the last 3 to 4 months, there's been an enormous PR push for nuclear across the board, across media and press. And the problem is that it doesn't really fit in with the reality of what's going on, the reality of the real energy transition.
Yeah, and let me come to you, and then I'll be back with you, Rainer, in just a moment. Do you see this as a sort of nuclear war, if you like, that for one side to win, the other side has to lose?
Well, what we see is an industry that is in trouble. We've seen Westinghouse going bankrupt. We've seen EDF, the French large company, basically in the books being bankrupt, and Macron trying to save it. Now, at that side, there's an normal push, but while they are pushing and making this PR push, what is going away, what we're losing, is the urgent discussions that we do need to take to tackle climate change, because that is what it is all about. Nuclear power is going, even if it would double its capacity, it would not reduce more than 4% of the current greenhouse gas emissions. That's only marginal. On the other hand, I mean, we need to go down to zero. We need to cut them 100% in the next 30 years. And the discussion that we need to have are about industry, are about pushing renewables, which are going to replace the fossil fuels.
Sorry to butt in, but what I don't understand about this debate is why it's either one side, renewables, or, I know we're talking about nuclear particularly, why is it one or the other? Why can't the two, Jan, live side by side?
It is not one or the other. Nuclear is marginal. I mean, the renewables are already doing the bulk of the work, and they're going to do the bulk of the work in the next 3 decades. On the margin, there plays a discussion about nuclear, followed or fueled by a lobby that is really struggling to survive. And they're surviving with all political means that they're trying to get their hands on at this moment. We're talking not about climate in Brussels at this moment, we're talking about nuclear in the taxonomy, which is ridiculous. The taxonomy, it's a taxonomy about sustainable financing, should be a tool for the finance industry to find their priorities for the coming 3 decades. Okay. And what are we discussing? Should nuclear be inside of that? That's a diversion from the real discussion.
Yeah, but what we're talking about with taxonomy is whether it should be on a list of sustainable fuels, and I don't see why necessarily it has to be excluded. You'll tell me your thoughts on that in just a moment, but Ryan, I want to come to you again. It is not either or, is it?
Absolutely. It's not either nuclear or renewables. It is nuclear and renewables against fossil fuels. I mean, fossil fuels is what we have to get rid of, and we need all tools we have available. And international players like the IPCC, they are pretty clear on that. We don't have the luxury to leave one or the other tool aside. And I would say, Jan, if you think nuclear is marginal and the nuclear industry is so much in trouble, then why do you care at all? Why are you so anti-nuclear as you are? If nuclear is marginal, well, leave it to die and don't care about it.
Okay, I'll throw that one back. I'll throw that one back to you, Jan, just for a quick response, and then continue with Rainer. I don't want to leave you out of it altogether, Mark, so I'll be back with you in just a sec. Jan.
Well, I find it very funny. The French press accused the environmental movement of lobbying against nuclear over the last time, and I've been adding up the numbers, and I saw that, for instance, Greenpeace is putting less than a quarter of a full position over the last few years into bringing information about nuclear into Brussels, and that against large lobby organizations like Foratom or the World Nuclear Associations, which have scores of people in Brussels that are knocking on all the doors. And the environmental movement is trying to save the climate. And the environmental movement has recognized that nuclear is not playing a very large role, but that talking about nuclear is diverting the attention from what really needs to be done.
Okay, Rainer, back with you in just a moment, but I do want to bring Mark in here. But first, we're going to hear from Angela Merkel, German Chancellor, as of now, but not for very much longer. And she says there are other countries that choose differently, and in doing so, it will be easier for them in some ways to achieve climate neutrality. I still believe that in the long term, nuclear energy isn't a sustainable form of energy production for Germany. The die is cast. So, Mark, why do you think she believes, or the argument goes, that it is going to be easier for those countries that don't take what she considers to be the hard choices of shutting down nuclear power?
Because Germany's performance is terrible, and she is going to own that legacy for her remaining years. There's a reason why Germany has not reduced its fossil fuel electricity capacity in 2 decades. They've doubled the amount of electricity capacity generation they have available. They've doubled, and they haven't reduced fossil fuel generation capacity at all. Their emissions, like in many countries, are going up this year because last year was unusual, but they're expected to go up next year and the year after that. And Germany is desperately trying to include fossil fuels in the green taxonomy that our esteemed guest Jan Haverkamp says is so precious. There's a reason why Germany's including those fossil fuels, and Angela Merkel is going to say, oh, well, it's easy enough for the countries with nuclear to reduce emissions, but we have to depend on fossil fuels because all we have is the weather. We have to get the pipeline from Russia because we have to have that fossil fuel energy. The reason why Germany is saying that is because they were anti-nuclear before the whole climate thing, and it will always be more important to them to get rid of nuclear, ignore climate goals, give away our future, us young people, and stick with the anti-nuclear course. Also, I'd like to mention the amount of money against the nuclear lobby is so much larger than the nuclear lobby. If you've been to C4, folks, or if you've gone to the World Nuclear Association, it's not large or fancy. This isn't. Let's say the young guys going into banking are not looking at nuclear lobbying as a good counter, but they are looking at renewables.
Paul, you've got an ironic smile, I think, on your face.
Well, I mean, look, lobbying is not the point. The point is climate. And if you like, the point is Germany, the largest, strongest, most capable economy in Europe, non-nuclear, with plans now to get out of coal by 2030, with using gas as a transition, of course, for the time being, increasing enormously its renewable. I mean,
but why not keep nuclear as part of the portfolio?
Okay, how about this? I've been looking, and a lot of people have been looking very closely in the last year or so. Climate models are running out. We know that nuclear needs to be beside large bodies of water to get cooling. That's either by the coast or by rivers, by water bodies. Now, we know what's going to happen to the coasts, and we know what's going to happen to the rivers. The problem is that nuclear power, the USP of nuclear power, that it will help the climate, it'll do precisely the reverse. As sea levels ramp, and especially as storms surge, basically what happens in certain atmospheric conditions, the sea just ups and goes inland. Nuclear power plants are booked to flood.
Well, actually, Rainer, no, hang on, Mark, you've had to say, Rainer, reporting back on Fukushima, however many years ago it was, the storm surges there were part of the problem.
No, the problem in Fukushima was that the plant wasn't safe against that kind of catastrophic events, and that in turn was a problem with the Japanese safety regulations. And the Japanese are now very aware of that, and they founded an independent nuclear safety agency in 2012.
But what we're seeing here, to some extent, backs up what Paul has been saying, is that there are people who either don't know what they're doing or are prepared to cut corners, however many inspectors and oversight bodies you may have.
Yeah, and that's why it is so important to agree on international standards and to stick to them. And that is why we have the IAEA. Japan diverted from these standards in the 1990s, and that led to the Fukushima accident. And still, after 3 reactor meltdowns, no single person died from radiation. Well, you can dispute that and say, well, there was one person who had an exceptionally high dose and died from lung cancer, but the accident was not that so catastrophic that many people died from radiation.
Okay.
No one.
All right. Mark, let me come back to you. I know you think you've got the word from high-placed sources, I think, at the centre of power in Brussels, that the pro-nuclear lobby is probably going to be able to be put on this sustainability list, correct?
Well, yeah, but it's not because of the power of the pro-nuclear lobby, let me tell you. It's because of the survival of Eastern European states. It's about if you have a problem with not enough oxygen, literally nothing is more important in your life. Not your relationships, not your house, not your career. You have to get oxygen. This is about survival. And the countries around Europe cannot do what Germany does. Germany is running their coal plants at very low capacity while keeping them online. Only Germany is rich enough to do that. Germany is faking out the EU, telling them to close their fossil fuels while keeping their own. The rest of Europe sees this as survival. If it wasn't about survival, the nuclear lobby would have no chance. Young people like me are pro-nuclear, but we can't overcome the embedded folks like Jan and Paul.
Okay, well, let's throw this to Jan because we're running out of time. We're running out of time quite quickly. What if the pro-nuclear lobby wins this one?
Well, it will not change the reality that much. It will change the reality a little bit. We will get a longer discussion about nuclear, and it will further diverge from what we really need to do. But in the end, no more nuclear power stations will be built because they're just too expensive. They're too much of a financial risk. Banks know that, and they're not going to step in. Large investors know that they're not going to step in. The investors that are stepping into nuclear are stepping into new designs, into new tries, and that's high-risk investments from people that can afford those high-risk investments.
Okay, so Paul, if France, being in the pro-nuclear camp, does come out ahead of Germany, being in the anti-nuclear camp in this one, will that recenter a certain power balance within Europe, or does this not matter? Is it peripheral to politics?
It's probably peripheral to the fundamental debate. I mean, France's Grand Carénage upgrade of its reactors is going to cost between 50 and 100 billion euros. And then France says it's going to produce a few more of these failing EPRs. So what Jan says is essentially true. It's just too expensive. It's just too expensive, and taken in the large context, it'll do very, very little.
Okay, one quickie for you, Rainer. We've probably got about 40 seconds. You're shaking your head, presumably at the statement that it's too expensive.
Yeah, nuclear power plants are expensive, but nuclear is not. And that is a nuclear power plant can run about at a minimum of 60 years, maybe 80 years or 100 years or even longer. And over that time, it's no longer expensive. It's just the initial investment.
Okay, that's all right if you've got the money in the bank. Thank you very much indeed. Much appreciated. Thank you very much indeed. 2 of you pro-nuclear, 2 of you anti-nuclear. We will wait to see fairly soon, I think, which side of the argument comes out on top. Will nuclear power be added to the EU's sustainable sources list? It may sound esoteric, but I suppose in the end of the day, it's actually very, very important. Thank you for coming on the programme. Wherever you happen to be watching, we thank you for taking the time to watch this edition of Roundtable. Until next time, from me, David Foster, and the team, very goodbye.